All right, so this is chapter 4 of Belgrave's and Allison's book, African American Psychology, and this is for Oakwood University's Black Psychological Perspectives course, or Psychology 431. Let me begin with a word of prayer, then we'll get into the conversation here. Dear Lord, thank you for waking us up this morning. Thank you for this opportunity for us to share and connect regarding Black psychology. Today's topic is race and racism, and please be with us as we look to move higher. Thank you for your many blessings. Amen. All right, so I got just a few moments this morning to connect. It's good and early. It's about 7 o'clock here at Oakwood University. Class is today at 1, but I still like to make sure that we're recording each session. Seems to go better when I record it here rather than in the classroom. So let's get right into it. So some of our topics today have to do with the challenges with race and equity, some definitions on race specifically, ethnicity, racial identity, assimilation, prejudice and racism. So, really just going through these definitions because there's so many of them. I think it's important to have a sense of the range and spectrum of the conversation going on. Also, some of the consequences of racism. And then, what they call, the book called Afrocultural Coping or Afrocultural Coping, ways that Black people have found to cope with and in the midst of racism. Some other pieces we'll be looking at are racial socialization and what parents have done and may do. Colorism, which I think is not a completely new section, but there is some other dimensions that I think have been added to the textbook. And we'll talk about some other issues with common goals to help address some of these issues. And as well as with each of the chapters, we've been talking about measures, and particularly there are measures of racism in different ways. So, and finally, I'll pose some discussion questions, but we leave that for our classroom. But you're more than welcome to chime in on any comments. All right, so let's begin with our vocabulary. Some key important vocabulary words definitely are race, right? Ethnicity, racism, which can be institutional, cultural, aversive, overt, and covert types of racism, right? A term I think most students should know who are college educated, but definitely in graduate school, is salient, right? Another one is construct, right? And not necessarily in a verb, but more as a noun. And I won't spend a lot of time on that one, but I will say, like, construct, and forgive me, I'm a DC fan, and one of my favorite characters are the Green Lanterns. And the Green Lanterns, what makes them powerful is that they have a little ring, and that ring lights up green, but they're able to use their will or their mind to develop new constructs and ideas that should be able to fight against certain enemies, right? So the constructs that we develop in our mind, the theories, the ideas that are able to withstand scrutiny, but sometimes even time, are important to consider. I mentioned before acculturation and assimilation. Another vocabulary word is colorism. And I'm adding a couple others that I'm giving from Dr. Kobe Kambone, who recently passed away, but also my good friend Dr. Adisa Ajamu. And this is white misanthropy, right? Misanthropes sometimes in a dictionary are thought of, people who are just up to no good, but definitely if we contrast this when we're often using the term white supremacy, no, we're really talking about white misanthropy and problems, right? People going out of their way to do no good. Finally, a more contemporary term, and the book doesn't talk much about, but transracial. And I think if we're keeping up with the current vocabulary of the day, it's good to know these vocabulary words. So again, race, ethnicity, racism, salient, construct, acculturation and assimilation, colorism, white misanthropy, versus white supremacy, and transracial. Those are just a few vocabulary words. I'm sure there may be others, but definitely those are worth looking up and making sure that you're versed in and aware of. All right, so and I have a video that I'll be showing the class here, and you may be able to look it up. And it's really about, how people may start a race, and it's a visual of people starting a race, but yet the people of color are hamstringed with sharks and symbolizing the Middle Passage. They're dealing with obstacles to overcome, symbolizing Jim Crow after slavery, and many other challenges, but yet they're still expected to not only finish the race, but be ahead of the race, right? So some pieces that the book brought out is that the idea of race is not necessarily a good construct or idea, right? All Earthlings share 95% of the same DNA. We are a lot more alike than different, by a lot, right? And there's been inconsistency between many legal definitions of race, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Differences in how people define themselves in the USA and around the world, and it is inconsistently defined as a construct in research. So we have, first, a lot of the conversation on race was about biology, which led to eugenics, right? And a lot of very direct policy that's stating that black people were somehow inferior and subhuman, right? Then we have cultural and social political definitions of race as well. In psychology, racial categories tend to have no conceptual meaning, is one of the things that the book's brought out. So let me go into these definitions of race, right? And one of the definitions that the book starts with is that race is a social construct that artificially divides people into distinct groups based on appearance, ancestry, cultural affiliation, history, ethnic classification, and political needs of a society. Again, artificially dividing people. And actually, I didn't get that from the book. I got that first definition from the National Association of School Psychologists Best Practices book, as written by Dr. Antoinette Miranda. The next definition is dictionary definition, right? And it says that race is a family, tribe, people, or nation belonging to the same stock, a class or kind of people identified by shared interest, habits, or characteristics, a category of humankind that shares distinctive physical traits, right? The first one that we talked about was talking about, this artificial division. This next one talks about shared interests, habits, or characteristics, and added this other piece about distinctive physical traits. And I'm going to use kind of an old school word, but hearkening back to some of the 1800s, early 1900s types of views of race about physical traits. The next one, right, is from the U.S. Census. And the U.S. Census, based on that person's self-identification, this is interesting, self-identification of the race or races with which he or she most closely identifies. So social political constructs should not be interpreted as scientific or anthropological, according to the U.S. Census. All right. This last definition is from Casas and Helms. Casas in 1984 and Helms in 1990. And the book kind of combined these two, but a subgroup of people possessing a definite combination of physical characteristics of genetic origin, the combination of which to varying degrees distinguishes the subgroups from the others. This final one was kind of a combination of the first two, with this artificial division, physical traits, as well as some similarity. Actually, kind of the first three kind of all weaving together. But what's interesting to me is that I could easily find these four definitions, and our book brought out three of the four. All right. Moving on to some other definitions. Ethnicity, right? And a lot of people tend to use ethnicity when they're doing research on given populations rather than race, because what by and large has been in the social sciences has become to be known that race is an artificial construct. Again, we share so much more in common that ethnicity at least is more honest to the actual phenomena as a social construct. Now I'll get into the definition here. Ethnicity is a social construct that divides people into smaller groups based upon a shared sense of group membership, values, behavioral patterns, language, political interests, ancestry, and geographical base. There's some overlap there with race, as you can hear it. But I would also say that, my being a Seventh-day Adventist can loosely be considered a type of ethnicity or ethnicity subtype. And I'm saying that very, very loosely. But if I looked at shared sense of group membership, values, behavioral patterns, language, political interests, ancestry, and I hear people talk about, I'm a fifth generation Adventist, right? Next one here, racial or ethnic identity. An individual's awareness and experience of being a member of that racial or ethnic group, right? And in America, we tend to kind of put the two together, largely because, right, Americans who were descended from enslavement, right, or had to endure enslavement, right, they weren't really allowed to have an ethnicity. They were more focused on their race. Finally, this other term, assimilation, right? And here's the definition. The process by which an individual group acquires the cultural traits of a different ethnic or cultural group. The disappearance of a cultural group that is distinct from the dominant culture. This definition is huge and has broader implications. The book didn't necessarily bring that out as much, but I want you to consider this. In Argentina and other parts of South America, there was a term called whitening, right? And it was the policy of the nation, particularly in Argentina, some parts of Brazil, to import Europeans to whiten the nation, right? And that included, especially after the end of World War I and World War II, Germans who immigrated to places like Argentina. There is actually a small village that is pretty much a transport and transplant of Germany in Argentina, right? Utilizing this concept of whitening, right? And that's kind of the extreme version of assimilation. But another version of assimilation is that I no longer outwardly publicly identify as whatever ethnicity either my parents were or what the ethnicity was that I immigrated with. Now I am solely an American, right? And that's more the definition I think people are familiar with, or the example, I should say. Right. So some other definitions, right? Now we're shifting gears into prejudice and racism, right? So the book gave one definition of prejudice: rigid and favorable attitudes directed towards a group that are formed regardless of facts. Again, rigid and unfavorable attitudes, right? And I underlined attitudes there, okay? Right. I got three definitions of racism that the book gave. One is a belief that humans can be validly grouped according to their biological traits, and that these identifiable groups inherit certain mental, personality, and cultural characteristics. One group acts to exert power over another based on those beliefs of superior over inferior traits. All right, so that's where we get the mindset of eugenics, right? And also white misanthropy, or white supremacy in some people's minds. Next definition, or number two, includes beliefs, attitudes, institutional arrangements, and here's the key, and acts that tend to denigrate individuals or groups because of phenotype characteristics or ethnic group affiliation, right? So if I go particularly, right, to the legal realm, we're talking about hate crimes, right? That's focused specifically on acts that not only denigrate, but also may cause harm to people because of their phenotype characteristics or ethnic group affiliation. The last definition here on racism: the transformation of race prejudice through the exercise of power against a racial group perceived as inferior, whether individually or institutionally. Right. So you see, we have these three definitions of race. Prejudice is somewhat separate because it lacks one of the pieces of power or action. Right. Okay, so what are the consequences of racism? Right, we have the injustice system. Right, police stops, incarceration rates are vastly disproportionate. I heard one scholar talk about that there are more black men incarcerated in America than there are women all over the world, women whatever their ethnicity, right? So and there's been a rapid climb, like a 300% increase in the amount of people who are incarcerated in the United States, period, since 1971, and the majority of those people being African American. If we also connect that to the 13th Amendment, which still allows slavery within penal institutions, it's a huge issue. Right, the next consequence, and we have 4 of these consequences here. The next one is health and mortality rates. And one of our Board of Trustee members, Dr. David Williams from Harvard, writes quite a bit about the issues related to not only access, but also perceived tolerance of pain by black people, so they're less likely to be served when they are even telling their doctors that I am in pain. Right. Next, housing or lack thereof. So, the old school thing of redlining and saying that you're not allowed to live here in this particular neighborhood, or you're not allowed to, rented this apartment, even though another person had come trying to rent the apartment. The film If Beale Street Could Talk related some of this idea that, sometimes couples weren't able to rent, but yet a woman could rent by herself, or a man could rent by themselves, depending on the interest of the owner of the building, right? And then there's also, gentrification, as a certain property, although it had been in a mostly community of color, as a certain property increases in value, they raise the rents or they raise the prices and eventually push those people out, particularly African Americans who may have been the first in their family to own a home, and now they're displaced. Okay. Finally, stressors, general stressors on the mind, body, and spirit due to the chronic nature of racism. Okay. All right. So if you're dealing with these consequences or these issues with racism, right, there has to be some way to cope with them. And so the book talks about Afrocultural coping. Not that men or women do not do both, but one is more likely. So women are more likely to utilize cognitive or emotional debriefing, in that they'll kind of think through, they'll also talk with another woman to try to cope with whatever type of racism or racist experience that they've gone through, right? Spiritual center coping, right? Going to church, mosque, synagogue, some other type of spiritual women's event or retreat. Women are more likely to engage in that. The collective coping, right, where black folks come together in a communal space, both men and women are more likely to do that. And finally, the ritual-centered coping, where it may be more traditional type things, and what I'm saying is traditional, classic African traditional type coping. Women may be more likely to engage in that, at least African American or Americans, Black Americans within Africa, or Black Americans within America. Let me get that correct. But what's interesting to me is how Black men may do more collective coping, and that may be why fraternity is so powerful for men, sports, those kinds of things. Just some thoughts there, but that's what the research was saying, right? Shifting gears a little bit, racial socialization is really about the messages that young people get growing up, but also kind of what young adults may get as well about how to be in the world, right? Black culture and Black interactions are overtly taught. They're not something that's largely within the culture. You have to be intentional about teaching young people how to be Black. And we see this with college students. I just read a study done by Dr. Sean Harper and Dr. Christopher Newsom about young Black men's first college experiences in like their first year. And one of the challenges, two of the challenges, I will say, the first one had to do with feeling unprepared academically. The other one, particularly for Black young men who ended up at historically black colleges and universities was that they went through some level of culture shock, because they hadn't necessarily been socialized around other black youth. Conversely, the young black men who may have grown up around mostly black people who were going to predominantly white institutions struggled because they hadn't been socialized about how to be black around more than black people, right? So socialization must be intentional. The next thing is interacting and getting along with other racial groups is important, as I was just talking about with that study. And then finally, learning to cope with the status of being black within America or whatever area a black person finds themselves in. And the last piece is there are other types, and there may be a passive coping to confrontation or withdrawal, right? So I may just kind of step away and not engage in really confronting this racism, but I find some way to stay alive. I had one mentor, her name is Dr. Dale Rowe, and he went to Hampton University and later on went to the Ohio State University for his PhD. And one of the things he said, which stuck with me, is that he chose to fight them at Ohio State University and fight for space for black people. He chose to do that. Whereas people like me and even some of my heroes like Asa Hilliard, they said, man, just get that paper as however you can. And when I went to my doctoral program, all I did was focus on getting done. I still wanted to make space to speak about issues for black folks, but my issue was, and Dr. Hilliard's answer kind of rung in my ears about get done, right? So you can go out there and enact policy. Once I became a college professor, I chose to fight them, and I told them I was going to fight them right up front. But both of these are two types of coping, right? Either very overtly challenging the system that's bringing you under, or at least the racism within that system, or deciding to retreat so you can live to fight another day, right? Colorism is another aspect that pervades a lot of black life, but for a while black people just kind of kept it insular and did not have the conversation outside because there were broader issues to discuss. Frankly, when you're legally discriminated against, forget the whole colorism argument, and particularly in America, and the law was if you had one drop of black blood, specifically if your grandparents were found to be black in some regard, you were considered black and was subject to the discriminatory laws as well. So this has been the fight, but now that fight isn't necessarily over, but many of the battles have been won. The conversation about our physical features has been important. So, discussions around hair, skin, body type, light or dark, and what's preferred has been an ongoing conversation. I remember growing up in the 80s, we started talking about, even dark black is beautiful, and having a discussion about dark black versus light skinned folks. And this discussion was happening in popular culture. Academics, educators, and other folks had been having a conversation for almost a century, but the popular discourse hadn't really gotten there and really been able to even make jokes and have this broader discussion about it in a more public fashion, right? So with colorism, often there's discrimination from non-black people and black people. I'm too light for black people and I'm too dark for white people. Sometimes it's some of the conversations that people have, right? The other thing that contributes to this is the media. If we look and if I can decontextualize for a moment from African Americans, if I look at Spanish language TV, although most of the people I grew up with and I know in California who were Mexican or from Central or South America who spoke Spanish, they were not white. Right, they were either dark skinned or had very dark hair. But then when I looked at Spanish language TV, most of the people on there had blonde hair. It just didn't stack up, right? And in America, it's similar, and it was rare, but there has been a direct fight to make sure that black people are represented in media. And some of that I think is a very direct economic input because black people watch a lot of TV, as we discussed last session. Okay. Some other issues with colorism is that income, health, education, and incarceration. Lighter skin tone is a predictor of better outcomes or less discrimination at times in these different areas. Although African Americans who look more white are offering poor health, and some of this is explained by discrimination by other black people. So on the extreme ends of the color continuum, it can be deleterious to one's health because of this idea that I don't necessarily fit in anywhere, right? So how we treat each other is important. There's a great documentary and by one of my mentors from California. Her name is Dr. Cheryl Grills, former president of the Association of Black Psychologists, called Dark Girls, which addresses some of these challenges with colorism, right? So this contact hypothesis in group members, right? If we interact or have contact with others, under what circumstances do we do so, particularly when we're addressing racism, right? Are we utilizing common goals? Are we looking at cooperation? Do we perceive ourselves, and do we actually have equal status so we can have a win-win relationship, right? If one group is perceived to have more status, we're either reactionary or we're having to constantly fight to get that higher status, right? Do we have support outside of the current environment, right? For our efforts to fight racism, right? If we're subordinate, right, or is there at least common group goals, right? And can we subordinate our own individual goals for these common group goals, right? And if we're looking at societal membership, is there a macro approach? The next chapter, I'll discuss a little bit more about a conversation that's happening on social media in some news outlets regarding American descendants of slavery versus everyone else who may call themselves African American, but they're either one or two generation away from immigrant status, more recent immigrant status, and how that's having a conversation about larger group goals versus individual goals versus particular cliques, and etc. All right. So shifting gears a bit, but if we want to study these things in larger fashion, we'd look at some of these measures of racism. And so Katz and Haas in '88, they develop a pro-black versus anti-black scale to kind of see a continuum, a range of kind of where a person may lie in regards to their views on race and racism. Henry and Sears in 2002 developed the symbolic racism scale, right? I would say in the late 90s, 2000s, Harvard began working on the implicit association test, and they still work with this, which has led to a lot of the conversation around implicit bias, right? Which has some challenges. I find it to be a weaker construct when I'm dealing with very direct and overt racist. But if I'm dealing with somebody who wants to improve and change, yes, it's a great concept. There's also physiological reaction research. I mentioned before, Dr. Williams, he tends to write a lot about, Black folks' physiological reaction to ongoing stressors of racism, right? And then there's the IRRS by Dr. Sean Usi and Ponterado. That was developed in 1996. And I'm saying Dr. Uchi's name because I had a chance to meet him. He's published a great documentary on Black psychology and the beginnings of Black psychology. But this index of race-related stress, I think, is important if you follow his work. He talks quite a bit about some of the impacts of racism and how people perceive race. Okay. And finally, the Racism Related Coping Scale, RCCS, by Forsyth and Carter, is an important measure. So these 6 measures or ways to look at racism are important for our dialogue. And I wanted to finish this in a half hour, and I'm about to get it done. Right, so just a little over a half hour. But these discussion questions that we'll have, and you can feel free to chime in on, but we'll be having in our class, what are some regional variations to how Black people cope with racism, whether you're in the southern part of the United States, whether you're in the western part, whether you're in the northern part, whether you're in the middle part of the United States. How do people cope with racism? right? What are some common ways, regardless of region, that Black people cope with racism? And I would even say, let's look at that internationally, right? Next, what are some microaggressions, which are broken down to assaults, invalidations, and insults? How can we counter those things? And these are kind of everyday kind of slights that people experience, particularly around race, right? And microaggressions, I'm going to add that to the vocabulary word list. What role does Black people's religious traditions help or hurt in overcoming racism? The book talks about that a bit, but you may have some thoughts and ideas. All right, so trying to keep these at least to a half hour so we can have some good conversation and discussion later on. And also, so I'm just not running my mouth so much. Last chapter was just very, very long. And I do have some other thoughts, and I may post an addendum to this, which is the addendum will be based on my research. But this was part 1 of chapter 4. Right. Thank you for tuning in, and looking forward to hearing some of your feedback. Hope all is well with you, and have a blessed day.